Yajnadana tapak karma natyajyam karyameva tat yajnodanam tapaschaiva pavanani manishinam etanyapitu karmani sangam tyaktva phalani cha kartavyani me patta nishchitam matam uttamam. Nishchitam matam uttamam. Krishna categorically declares, this is my conclusive, my definitive opinion, hey Arjuna. In response to Arjuna's profound question, right at the beginning of the 18th chapter, Krishna initially presents the Purva Paksha on what is Tyaga, what is Sannyasa. After having presented the Purva Paksha, the various opinions, the opinions of various sages, various rishis belonging to different schools of thought, he then presents his definitive opinion. He gives his conclusion. In the 5th shloka, Krishna declares that one must not abandon yajna, dana and tapa. Yajna, dana, tapaschaiva natyajyam karyameva tat. Yajnodanam tapaschaiva pavanani manishinam. It is only through performance of yajna, dana and tapas that one can get purified. Movement of insentient things is motion. When motivation gets added to motion, it becomes action. When the action becomes selfless and contributory in nature and aligned to a higher cause, it becomes duty. Krishna therefore says, one must lead one's life performing duties, not just actions. Actions by design are driven by the forces of the vasanas. Actions by design are motivated by the bodily impulses, whereas duty is motivated by selflessness, is motivated by the principle of Tyaga. Krishna therefore tells Arjuna that, hey Arjuna, Tyaga and Sannyasa are one and the same, and Tyaga is fundamental to everything that a human being has to perform. There are duties that are prescribed, that are ordained, that cannot be abandoned. Yajna, dana, tapas are ordained, are mandatory, and only by performing yajna, dana and tapas, only by basing every action on the principles of yajna, dana and tapas, a binding action can be transformed into a liberating action. Etanyapitu karmani sangam tyaktva phalani cha kartavyani me partha nishchitam matam uttamam. In Shloka 6 of the 18th chapter, Krishna therefore concludes on Tyaga and Sannyasa, the definition of Tyaga and Sannyasa, by stating his opinion, his firm opinion, his definitive statement on Tyaga, on the nature of duty that needs to be performed. He says here, Arjuna, etanyapitu karmani. All these works, he's referring to works based on the principles of yajna, dana, and tapas. All these works, etanyapitu karmani, sangam tyaktva phalani cha. Sangam tyaktva phalani cha. Even these works based on yajna, based on dana and tapa, have to be rooted in the principle of Tyaga, rooted in the principle of detachment from the action, detachment from the result of the action. Sangam tyaktva phalanicha kartavyānīti me partha. Every work has to be done as a duty, not just as a motion or as an action, but has to be performed as a duty, which is selfless in nature, which is contributory in nature, which is always aligned to a higher cause. Only when all these three factors come together, the work that is done becomes a duty. Selflessness, contribution, and alignment to a higher cause. Sangam tyaktva phalanicha kartavyānīti me partha nishchitam matam uttamam. This is my conclusive opinion here, Arjuna. Now, detachment, talking about detachment from results, Krishna has repeatedly affirmed that detachment from results does not mean irresponsibility. Detachment from results does not mean escaping responsibility. It is about not letting our consciousness stay trapped at the material level. When our consciousness stays trapped at the material level, we are always subject to dualities, the swings of our mind, elation at one moment, dejection at the other moment. Detachment from the results, Krishna affirms, prevents one from getting subject to the pressures of dualities. And Krishna, when he is prescribing yajna, dana, and tapas to be, that are ordained, that are mandatory, that are to be not abandoned, is essentially reiterating that every work has to be performed as an offering to him. And therefore, when work is performed for the sake of Krishna, results do matter. When the work is performed for the sake of Krishna, as an offering to Krishna, results matter. Results, one needs to care for results. Why? Because one cares for the one to whom the results are offered. And one also understands that he is more important than the results. And one also understands that he cares more for the content of our hearts than the product of our works. Krishna, therefore, here reiterates the necessity of performing yajna, dana, and tapas rooted in the principle of tyaga, sanyasa. Tyaga and sanyasa mean one and the same. It is necessary for a caterpillar not to abandon weaving its cocoon. If a caterpillar abandons weaving its cocoon, then it can never transform into a butterfly. A caterpillar needs to necessarily weave its cocoon, and it is in that cocoon, when it is engaged in that cocoon, the transformation begins, the metamorphosis begins. And then eventually a beautiful butterfly breaks out from the cocoon and soars into the sky. Performing works based on the principles of yajna, dana, and tapas, rooted in tyaga, is purifying in nature. We, the caterpillars, then get transformed into beautiful butterflies through this process of purification. Krishna is talking about freedom in action, not freedom from action. Freedom in action is to do our work based on tyaga. And when there is freedom in action, eventually we get freedom from all materialistic actions. Tyaga, therefore, is the principle that converts mundane actions into liberating actions. In a way, Tyaga can be looked upon as a trade-off or choosing in the trade-off between instant pleasures, present pleasures, and future treasures. Choosing the future treasures over present pleasures is Tyaga. Every choice that we make is a trade-off between present pleasures versus future treasure. Now, even every human endeavor, every human progress, every progress made, even materialistic progress made, that raises, that elevates humankind above the animal kingdom, is because of this unique ability to trade the present pleasure for a future pleasure, for a future treasure, a present pleasure for a future satisfaction. When Newton looked at the apple falling from a tree, he traded the present pleasure of enjoying, relishing the apple to a future treasure of understanding physical reality. Instead of Newton, if a monkey were to have looked at the apple falling from the tree, it would have simply walked towards the apple, picked it up, and would have relished the apple. What differentiated a monkey from Newton, what differentiated Newton from a monkey, is that trading off present pleasure for a future treasure. Tyaga is the principle where we sacrifice instant gratification, short-term wants, for the sake of long-term gains. Tyaga is all about focus on gaining long-term and sacrificing short-term. Tyaga is about sacrificing present pleasures driven by bodily needs. And Krishna therefore emphasizes that this Tyaga has to be fundamental. But hey Arjuna, this Tyaga is also threefold in nature. This is what Krishna earlier talked about as well. Tyaga is threefold. Tyaga based on the guna. Based on the guna, the Tyaga can also be threefold in nature. If the guna, the dominating guna, is tamasic, then the Tyaga is tamasic in nature. If the dominating guna is rajasic, then the Tyaga is rajasic in nature. If the dominating guna is sattvic, then the Tyaga is sattvic in nature. Niyatasya tu sanyasaha karmano nopapadyate mohastasya parityagaha tamasaha parikirtitaha. Tamasaha parikirtitaha. A certain type of Tyaga is tamasic in nature, Krishna says. Arjuna, you need to understand that renunciation is important. Renunciation is the foundation of all works, but renunciation also is of three types. Tyaga is of three types. And therefore, unless it is Sattvika Tyaga, then the Tyaga that is performed is of no use. What is Tamasika Tyaga? Krishna first takes up the Tamasa Tyaga. Niyatasya tu sanyasaha karmano nopapadyate. Niyatasya tu, the prescribed duties, sanyasaha. If one renounces, abandons the prescribed duties, karmano nopapadyate. Upapadyate, that which is worthy. Karmanaha na upapadyate. Niyatasya tu sanyasaha. One who abandons the works that are worthy to be done. Yajna, dana, tapas. They are prescribed, ordained, and therefore they are worthy duties that are to be carried out. when one abandons actions that are worthy, niyatasyatu sannyasaha karmanaha na upapadhyate mohastasya parityagaha. Mohatasya parityagaha. Abandoning prescribed duties overcome by moha. Overcome by moha. Now, renunciation need not be always be caused by illumination. Renunciation can also be caused by illusion. There is a difference between renunciation caused by illumination of the mind, and there is a between renunciation caused by illumination of the mind and renunciation caused by illusion of the mind. Tamasa parityagaha, renunciation caused by illusion and not illumination, caused by ignorance. Mohatasya parityagaha, tamasaha parikirtitaha. Krishna here says, hey Arjuna, when prescribed duty, when yajna, dana, and tapa, which are prescribed, which are ordained, when they are abandoned because of moha, because of illusion. The illusion here is misidentification with the body, misidentification with the mind. And when there is misidentification, and when one believes I am the body, one is in a state of illusion all the time. And because of this illusion, when one abandons one's prescribed duty, that abandonment, that renunciation is tamasic in nature. That renunciation is not the right renunciation. Moha, illusion, is caused when the mind is clouded. The clouding of the mind happens when there is crowding in the mind. Aneka chitta vibrantaha moha jala samavritaha prasakta kama bhogeshu patanti narakeshu chau. Krishna warns. Earlier in the 16th chapter, Krishna warned, patanti narakeshu chau. Delusion leads to degradation. Patanti narakeshu chau. One would descend, fall deep into the darkest, murkiest, gloomiest of hells, he says. Aneka chitta vibrantaha moha jala samavritaha. The moha, the delusion, is caused because of the crowding in the mind. Aneka chitta vibrantaha. When the mind is crowded with too many desires. When the mind is full of desires, and every desire competing for attention, it becomes very difficult to choose one over the other. When there are few desires, it becomes very easy or relatively easy to choose one over the other. But when there are too many, one is completely lost, not really knowing what's going on. Just like when one is caught in a crowd, one is crushed in a crowd. More than caught, we should say one is crushed in a crowd. One doesn't know what's going on, even when there is somebody stealing money from one's pocket. One is not aware of what's really going on. One gets completely crushed in the crowd. When the mind is crowded with desires, each desire competing with the other, then there is clouding of the intellect. The intellect ceases to perform. And in that situation, the mind is completely deluded. Aneka chitta vibrantaha moha jala samavritaha prasakta kama bhogeshu. Then those strong vasanas which trigger dominant desires, essentially one takes the path of least resistance, which is gratifying the senses. That's taking the path of least resistance. It's always very difficult to climb up. To go up needs effort. To fall down does not need any effort. Falling down into the abyss of hell takes no effort, Krishna says. To climb up requires a lot of effort. To come out of delusion, to uncloud the mind requires a lot of effort. Aneka chitta vibranta. If simplification does not take place, then there can be no unclouding. One is always in a state of delusion. And in that state of delusion, in that state of moha, one completely misses out what is worthy and what is not worthy. And in that process, when one is not able to discriminate between what is worthy and what is not worthy, the worthy works based on the principles of yajna, dana, and tapa are completely abandoned, because one chooses to take the path of least resistance. When one is completely deluded, total identification with the body, then taking the path of least resistance, catering to bodily needs, taking care of sense gratification becomes the summum bonum of life. In that kind of a state, Krishna says, when one gives up ordained, prescribed duties, that renunciation is tamasic in nature. That renunciation actually does not work for liberation. It actually is counterproductive. It actually triggers a deep fall. Patanti narakeshu chau. So therefore, renunciation has to be caused by illumination and not by illusion. Niyatasya tu sanyāsaha karmanaha na upapadyate moha tasya parityagaha tamasaha parikirtitaha. The antidote to this crowding of the mind is to ensure there is simplification of life, reducing the number of desires. Only then there can be prioritizing. Without that there can only be clouding because of crowding. And Krishna therefore cautions here, Arjuna, do not renounce, overcome by the force of tamas. Do not renounce yajna, dana, and tapas. Dukkamityeva yat karma. Dukkamityeva yat karma. Kaya kleshat bhayatyachet. Sakritva rajasam tyagam. Sakritva rajasam tyagam. Naivatyagam phalam labhet. Naivatyagam phalam labhet. The tyaga, which is rajasic in nature, will not yield any fruit. Renunciation by itself is only a means. What is the end? What is the end of renunciation? What is the goal? The goal is liberation. If renunciation does not yield liberation, such renunciation is of no use. Naivatyagam phalam labhet. If instead of being liberating in nature, if it binds one to samsara, then such renunciation is of no use. So Krishna here now talks about the renunciation, tyaga, which is rajasic in nature. Dukkha ityeva yat karma. When one is overpowered by the guna of rajas, the guna of rajas makes us to believe that we are independent, while the reality is that we are all interconnected. The whole created world is interdependent, and this interdependent world is dependent on Krishna. But the guna of rajas makes us believe that we are independent. And because of this, yajna, dana, and tapas are not naturally appealing. Dukkha mityeva yat karma, Krishna says. Dukkha, troublesome. Troublesome. The yajna, dana, and tapas become troublesome. And work becomes a source for frustration. Dukkha mityeva yat karma, kaya klesha bhayat yajet. One renounces, abandons action, abandons work in order to avoid bodily discomfort. To avoid, actions become burdensome. This kind of renunciation, dukkha mityeva yat karma, kaya klesha bhayat yajet. Abandoning actions, abandoning work because the work is troublesome, because it's frustrating, because it is burdensome. That kind of such a renunciation, such tyaga is sakritva rajasam tyagam. That kind of renunciation, Arjuna, is rajasic in nature. It is always tempting to go after immediate results. Anything which requires to be patient for long-term gain is definitely not welcome. It is definitely frustrating. So therefore, one who is overcome by the mode of rajas, by default, abandons yajna, abandons dana, abandons tapa. And this abandonment is not useful. Naiva tyagam phalam labet, Krishna says. This kind of renunciation will take you nowhere here, Arjuna. Frustration cannot be a trigger for renunciation. Frustration, in some cases, can be a starting point, but cannot be the cause for renouncing one's work. If frustration, because frustration, that whether it is frustration in sense gratification or it is craving for sense gratification, both are products of rajas. Kamayesha, krodayesha, rajoguna samudbhava, Krishna says. So both frustration and craving, in a sense, are products of rajoguna. So therefore, craving and frustration, both are to be avoided. If one is frustrated doing work and renounces that work is rajasic in nature. Many a times, one may think this work is not to my taste, and I renounce it, and therefore I'm doing the right thing, because renunciation is what the Shastras teach. But this kind of renunciation is essentially due to avoiding commitment to work, resistance, reluctance to commitment. And reluctance and resistance to commitment is not true renunciation. Krishna here is cautioning that one must not renounce work and take up sannyasa, the outward sannyasa, because if frustration is the cause for taking up outward sannyasa, it is just a matter of time before the desires that still persist, the rajas that is still in there, will manifest in various forms. One may say, isn't it right to look at the world as dukkhalaya and therefore renounce, therefore give up the world? Now, looking at the world as dukkhalaya is no doubt a trigger for renunciation. The world, no doubt, is dukkhalaya. The world is no doubt a place of misery, but that does not mean it is a place of just misery. It is a place of something more than when we look at the world only as dukkhalaya and renounce the world in frustration, that becomes rajasic in nature. Looking at the world as Dukkhalaya has to be in the mode of Sattva and not in the mode of Rajas. When there is a philosophical understanding that the world is Dukkhalaya, then such an understanding can lead to the right kind of renunciation. Otherwise, when I say my world is Dukkhalaya, born out of Rajas, then I look for another world which is Sukhalaya. One who is overpowered by Rajas is always looking at the world where the center is the I. So therefore, when one says out of Rajas, the world is Dukkhalaya, my world is Dukkhalaya. There should be definitely out there a Sukhalaya, and therefore I constantly chase for that Sukhalaya, the Bhogalaya, where I can have greater pleasures. One is falling trapped to the schemes of the mind. There is this popular saying, the grass is greener on the other side. Sometimes I wonder why it is said for human beings, the grass is greener on the other side. For the cows and donkeys, it is appropriate. But why? How should it matter whether the grass is greener or not greener for the human beings? The very fact that there is a proverb which says the grass is greener on the other side is essentially shows that we are materialistic in nature, always constantly chasing material rewards. So when one renounces based on the force of Rajas, when the Rajas is the cause for abandoning, then that abandonment is not going to be liberating in nature, it's going to be binding in nature. This is what Krishna says. That kind of Tyaga, hey Arjuna, is of no use. Tyaga, which is tamasic in nature, when Tyaga is tamasic in nature, one performs yajna, which is not based on Shastras. When Tyaga, which is tamasic in nature, then one performs tapas, which leads to self-torture, which leads to destructive actions. When Tyaga is tamasic in nature, one performs dana, which is inappropriate. One performs dana of inappropriate things at inappropriate places, at inappropriate times. When Tyaga is rajasic in nature, one performs yajna for the sake of selfish rewards. When Tyaga is rajasic in nature, one performs tapas for the sake of recognition and praise. When Tyaga is rajasic in nature, one performs dana for the as based on the principle of quid pro quo. Dana for the sake of gaining something, giving a little for the sake of taking more. So therefore, both these kinds of Tyaga, Tamasic Tyaga and Rajasic Tyaga, are to be completely avoided, and one must cultivate Tyaga, which is Sattvic in nature. This is what Krishna is going to take up in the coming shlokas. Let us reflect on this principle of Tyaga, which is fundamental to every action, for action to be transformed into duty. Only when there is freedom in action, freedom from attachment to the action and attachment to the results of the action, as Krishna says, only when there is this freedom, then there can be eventual freedom from all kinds of material actions. Tyaga, which is sattvic in nature, is the real Tyaga that needs to be cultivated. Sarvam Sri Krishna Arpanamastu.